Kia ora, everyone. My name is Leal Rodriguez. I'm a PhD student from the University of Auckland from the Department of Sociology under Dr. David Mayeda and under the School of Critical Studies in Education under Dr. Kirsten Locke. And I'm here to present my paper today on decolonizing the critical study of men and masculinities through a survey of Philippine masculinities. So here's a quick outline of what I'll be talking about, just a quick description of the Philippines, the idea of hegemonic masculinity and tunay na lalaki, Filipino manhood as framed by Psikolohiyang Filipino, and the conclusion for my study. So here's some facts about the Philippines. We have 7,107 islands. We are found in the Pacific Rim of Southeast Asia. We have around 100 ethnic groups, and we're actually 16th in the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report. What's interesting is we also have a complicated relationship, as do many, I suppose, with our identity because we have three colonizers. So the joke is we usually have an American first name but a Spanish last name, and we look Southeast Asian. That's because we've been under the Spaniards for more than 300 years, the Americans for about 50, and the Japanese during World War II. So it's really a mix. This identity is a mix of different cultures, different time periods as well. And I want to talk about masculinity specifically because we have such a high ranking for gender equality and we have such a strong feminist movement, which I personally also am a part of. And despite this, the Philippines has people like Rodrigo Duterte for president. And people say that the current president's leadership style is representative of all the men in the island. Right? He is the tunay na lalaki or true man. And his brand of political prowess is very problematic because, his violent language is very permissive of sexual and gender-based violence. He's very anti-poor with his violent drug war that only tackles people from lower socioeconomic classes. And he has a very strong stance with his get done attitude. And yet things like issues like with the pandemic are very not done. So it's very all talk, no action. And yet he seems to be representative and aspirational. So people want to be like him. And we want to know why. And this study of masculinity then is relevant because we want to understand why there's such a big gap between like the strong feminist movement, strong women, progressives in terms of maybe LGBT and rights and women's rights, and yet the everyday man still talks and acts like this, and most people want to be like him. And one thing that we want to look into, or one framework that I was using, because this study is actually part of my PhD project on studying masculinities in Philippine universities. So one concept I came around to is the idea of hegemonic masculinity by Raywin Connell. So hegemonic masculinity is the configuration of gender practice which embodies the current accepted answer to the problem of the legitimacy of patriarchy. So it looks at the dominant position of men and the subordination of both women and men who are not considered or who are not hegemonically masculine, right? So it's always one type of men dominating other types of men and women, and that's hegemonic masculinity, the very short summary. And I was thinking about it, and actually in the Philippines, there are multiple forms of hegemonic masculinity because actually in the Philippines, hegemonic masculinity or even a dominant masculinity is context specific. After all, masculinity can be understood as an aspect of personhood that requires some external acknowledgement from and continuous engagement with the broader social institution that work to shape and maintain it. So, the Philippines, hegemonic masculinity may not really be a thing, but what is a thing or what is something that we aspire to is this idea of tunay na lalaki or true manhood. So it's not about dominance, but it's actually about this idea of who really embodies, who is the true person, who is the tunay true man. And instead of looking at this, it depends on who is the true man, but for your context. So this study then asks, how does the indigenous framework of Psikolohiyang Filipino help us understand how studies frame Philippine masculinities, also in relation to this concept of true manhood? Because we want to understand if hegemonic masculinity can be applied to our context, but at the same time, maybe our own framework of Psikolohiyang Filipino or Filipino psychology, which is indigenous to the Philippines, can be used to enhance the concept so that we can understand also, how people from post-colonial societies, such as the Philippines, come to terms with this idea of masculinity, right? So I also want to explain what is Psikolohiyang Filipino. So this framework was born of Filipino thought, orientation, and experience, and it's also based on Filipino language, culture, and even values. And there's this idea of a shared inner self that moves towards freedom or liberation. And we look at this idea of pagtatanong-tanong as a method, like asking around, pakiramdam, like feeling around, shared inner perception, living with, or pakikipamuhay. So these are different ways to do Filipino psychology, right? And what's interesting about this framework is Virgilio Enriquez, the pioneer of the movement, really wanted to counter the dominant image of Western academia imposed on Filipino experience, because sometimes we have words or experiences that might translate to English a certain way, but they don't capture completely what we're trying to say, right? So that's why using this Psikolohiyang Filipino framework is so important when we want to understand Filipino manhood or the Filipino experience. The same way, using an indigenous framework is so important to capture the lived experience of people from that region or from that country. That being said, I also have a disclaimer. The way that we use indigenous in the Philippines is very different, because when we say indigenous, it can be related to those Filipinos who have land rights and special protections because of their current family group. So that's one kind of indigenous. But this indigenous really focuses on a cultural revalidation that fosters national identity and consciousness. So that indigenous has more to do with looking at the shared experience of Filipino-ness in this country. And one thing I want to look into when it comes to Psikolohiyang Filipino, manhood, etc., is this concept of labas or outer world and loob or inner world. So when we look at Filipino manhood, these two concepts are very important because they frame studies on masculinity, because Filipinos are both trait-oriented, meaning, there are certain traits that we like to adhere to. But at the same time, this outer world is very important because we have such strong family ties culturally and community ties that what the community says really has a strong impact on how someone embodies whatever identity or trait that they have. So because the Philippines does not have a single monolithic culture and a single monolithic masculinity that is dominant, what they do have is different traits given the loob, and these traits help direct or form the scaffolding that people's masculinity can stick to. Some of these traits include responsibility, family-orientedness, respect to one's spouse or women and the elderly in general, integrity, intelligence, academic achievement, strength, and a sense of community. So the people who made the Filipino adherence to masculinity or fame scale, Rubio and Green, actually looked at masculine ideology and norms that cut through the 77 ethno-linguistic groups of the Philippines, hoping to make an emic definition of Filipino manhood. And if you notice, through through these traits, there's a very strong push towards heteronormativity, being family-oriented, deference to wife, to be strong, at the same time that a man is not a woman. So to define manhood is to be separate from woman. Therefore, to be LGBT is also separate from manhood. Other things that influence Filipino manhood involve the outer world or the labas. And these include both homosociality and sexuality. So for homosociality, these are the informal peer groups called the barkada, which is very strong because this whole idea of this all-male peer group, the barkada, actually, or this kind of brotherhood, creates a safe space for masculine solidarity. And the barkada is actually also something that structures one's moral world, creates social capital for others, and at the same time, really helps someone form their identity, especially in the absence of family, a stable family, like a stable community, etc. For those who do not have access to resources and who may not have access to different ways to prove their masculinity, sexuality seems to be another way to prove masculinity. So through being sexually prolific, through a foster or siring many children. So that's another way to foster manhood, right? Through your external sexual relationships. So these are just some traits that or themes that came out when you look at or you study Filipino masculinity. And all of these contribute to the idea of tunay na lalaki, which have multiple contradictions because a true man, like ideally, is very, family oriented, polite, and respectful, and yet the ideal man is is aspirational, is someone like Duterte who is bastos pero maginoo, which is vulgar but respectful. So it's weird, a weird dynamic. That masculinity is context specific despite having universal traits. And it's also dependent on who your friends are, right? And depending on the institutions that form you. And looking forward, actually, I'd like to ask then, what are the influences on Filipino identity? Like, when it comes to both a post-colonial and colonial perspective. So a lot of these traits are actually, quote unquote, indigenized from values that the American Spaniards and even Japanese brought over when they colonized the country. So things like family-orientedness, deference to husband, deference to wife. Those could be considered Catholic values, or this whole you have to be respectful, you have to be polite, etc. So these are all traced back to certain colonizers as well. And yet the Filipinos, as a general culture, there are, even if it's context specific, there are some overlaps in terms of what they've indigenized. And someone like Duterte, who is considered like the epitome of this macho masculine figure, this father figure, is also someone who embodies it. So it's a very interesting dynamic. So how then do we look at different cultures? How do we indigenize these cultures? How are these indigenous? How do these continue to be perpetuated? And it's important to look at how certain institutions like media, politics, even education, which is what I'm looking into, perpetuate these traits. And lastly, because we're looking at this, how then can we foster a healthier masculinity? And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Or if you have similar studies, I'd love to hear about them. And thank you. Have a great day.